Good morning, Dr. Magalie Masamba, and welcome to today's podcast on deepening Nigeria infrastructure stock through public-private partnership. You are a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pretoria. You are also a senior fellow at the African Debt Justice Network. Previously, you worked as a public-private partnership specialist consultant at the World Bank. Thank you once more for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just want to give you some context before asking my first question. Nigeria has a huge infrastructure funding gap. The country vice president has said that the country needs about $3 trillion over the next 30 years to close this gap. By some estimate, Nigeria should be investing at least $30 billion a year in infrastructure. In 2020, about $6 billion was invested, which is about 20% of what is needed each year. It is clear that the private sector needs to fill this gap through public-private partnerships. My first question to you, Doctor, is why isn't this happening?
Thank you so much for this pertinent question. As you would know, the subject of the infrastructure gap and the focus on Nigeria is a very important one, and it's of personal interest to me. I'm quite actively involved in Nigeria's PPP space, especially when it comes to capacity development. Now, when it comes to Nigeria, it's a complex case because on one hand, Nigeria is Africa's largest economy, but it's also Africa's most populated country, and one that faces numerous challenges. I'll give one example of a sector, the electricity sector, which has the largest number of people without access to electricity in the world. So it is clear that the problems exist when it comes to access to utilities and also when it comes to infrastructure. I think the biggest problem today is the fact that there is a lack of finance, which you've correctly pointed out. There's a funding deficit. Public funds are not sufficient to meet that financing deficit for the infrastructure needs of the country. And the question is, what alternative sources of finance can be tapped into, and what could be the barriers to attract that finance? Right. You've already mentioned private finance, PPPs, which are definitely one very important source of finance. The Nigerian government is indeed focusing on attracting private finance into different sectors. So, for example, in June, if I'm not mistaken, in June this year, the Senate passed the Public-Private Partnership Regulatory Commission Bill, which seeks to improve the regulatory environment. And not only that, but quite recently, I believe it was last month in July, the federal government hosted a PPP event where the Secretary of the Government of the Federation pointed out the need for robust PPPs and highlighted some of the areas that needs to be strengthened where challenges are being faced. For example, the need to reduce risks associated to investing in Nigeria, the need to reduce the high cost of doing business, the need to tackle corruption, the need to improve governance, the need to create an enabling regulatory environment, and finally, the need to enhance competition in the market.
Thank you very much for this insight. A lack of clarity about institutional responsibilities and decision criteria was mentioned by the Vice President as a possible reason why, the private sector hasn't been involved to the level that is expected to fill that gap. Should we then, in quote, blame the quality of public institution in Nigeria? In particular, you mentioned the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission, the ICIC, the Bureau of Public Enterprises, the BPE, ministry, department, agency involved for lack of efficiency.
That's a very good question, because I think to have a robust or an effective PPP framework, the regulatory and institutional framework needs to be very clear, and the decision-making process needs to also be very clear. And the clearer that the decision-making process is, the more that you can avoid bad structuring or bad transactions, the more you can avoid corruption and so forth. I wouldn't really want to get into the blame game to see which institution would be responsible for some of the challenges that are being faced. But what we can say is that the country has an opportunity to improve the institutional structure. And you'd find with PPPs, it's really trial and error. And so now I see it more as of an opportunity that the country can improve the regulatory framework and the institutional framework governing PPPs. And I think there's already been a very positive step with the passing of the Public-Private Partnership Regulatory Commission bill, which will actually provide some clarity when it comes to, for instance, the role of the Regulatory Commission, which is an improvement on the institutional structure in the country.
You mentioned corruption. As you know, half of corruption cases in sub-Saharan Africa are related to infrastructure. I cannot, end this podcast without asking you this question on how can we tackle the problem of corruption so that every penny allocated to infrastructure development in Nigeria is actually used for that very same purpose.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Definitely, it's a pertinent one. And if I can just, point back to the words of the Secretary of the Government of the Federation, who just last month also pointed out the fact that, corruption was one of the challenges that could impact public-private partnerships. Now, the question is, how do we tackle, this big issue? So when it comes to infrastructure development, especially where the private sector is going to be brought in, I think there's a few opportunities or a few approaches that the Nigerian government can either consider if these are not being applied, or they can strengthen if they are being applied. So I've got a few ideas. Firstly, there's definitely the need to find the correct solution to the correct to a specific problem. So for example, with infrastructure, the solution might not be necessarily building new infrastructure. It could be closing, certain gaps or leaks, for example, if I can call them that. So, for example, in the electricity sector, there is an electricity subsidy that is mostly benefiting rich households. So, in that instance, there's a need to recheck and rethink what's going on in that sector. Secondly, I think that in infrastructure development, there's a big need to make the process very participatory. And here I'm speaking more on the need for community engagement from the very early stages of project development. So get the community involved at the very early stages of a project and keep them involved in that project throughout the life cycle of the project. A third idea that I have is definitely the need for transparency on project selection, preparation, and especially on the tender process. So there's a need for an open, competitive tender process, and also a very transparent monitoring and evaluation process. Fourthly, if I may, I've only got two more suggestions. I definitely think if the country is not already doing it, they definitely need to have a disclosure initiative. And I'm thinking more of the disclosure of signed PPP contracts that should be made public. And of course, this is subject to maybe redaction of certain sensitive market information, but generally the more disclosure, the better. And finally, participation goes beyond the community. It also speaks to broader stakeholders in the country that can provide additional checks and balances. For example, community-based groups, NGOs, and the civil society organization that can really play a big role in checks and balances, especially on environmental and social safeguards. So in a way, if you have a robust system that has many players, outside of government, the government institution and the private sector company that has won a tender, that could really help to fight issues of corruption and discrepancies.
Thank you so much for this insight. That was quite helpful. We came to the end of our podcast. We want it very short but highly efficient. We just want to thank you once more, Dr. Magalie Masamba, for honoring, our invitation today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.